There is a kind of violence that most men will never access, not because they lack the will, not because they lack the training, but because the body itself, the machine beneath the will, the architecture beneath the training, was simply not built for it. The men who understand this best are not actors. They are not athletes in the conventional sense. They are not the people you see in gyms, moving weight, building the visible, photographable version of physical power that the modern world has decided to call strength. The men who understand this best are the ones who have spent their careers studying what the human body can actually do, and more importantly, what it cannot. They are special forces trainers, selection instructors, the men who spend their professional lives deciding which bodies are capable of operating in the specific, unforgiving territory where the difference between what you can do and what you need to do is measured not in percentages, but in whether you come home. These men have assessed thousands of candidates. They have seen bodies that looked capable and were not, bodies that looked ordinary and were extraordinary, bodies that defied every visual prediction about what they would do under genuine pressure. And in the late 1980s and early 1990s, a small number of these men, trainers, consultants, former operators, who had moved into the world of film and television technical advising, encountered a Belgian actor whose body made them stop and look again and say things that none of them had expected to say about a man whose job was to pretend. His name was Jean-Claude Van Damme, and what they saw in him was not performance, it was engineering. To understand what special forces trainers recognized in Van Damme, you first have to understand what they were looking for. Selection for special operations units is not primarily a test of strength. It is not primarily a test of endurance, though endurance matters. It is not primarily a test of courage, though courage is assumed as a baseline entry requirement. It is a test of nervous system efficiency. The question being asked of every candidate, in every evolution of every selection course ever designed, is a single question with no clean answer until the body provides it. When everything is gone, when the sleep is gone, and the food is gone, and the warmth is gone, and the rational mind has long since stopped being useful, what does the nervous system do? Does it negotiate, or does it execute? Most bodies negotiate, even strong bodies, even trained bodies. The negotiation takes different forms: a fractional hesitation before a movement, a slight rounding of the spine under load, a millisecond of scanning behavior before committing to action. But the pattern is consistent. The body asks permission before it acts. The rare body, the body that selection courses are designed to find, does not ask permission. It simply does. Not from aggression, not from recklessness, but from a nervous system so deeply patterned, so thoroughly rehearsed in the specific grammar of physical action, that the gap between perception and response has been reduced to something that no longer registers as a gap at all. Jean-Claude Van Damme had been building that nervous system since he was 10 years old. Not because anyone told him to, not because he understood at 10 what he was actually constructing, but because the specific combination of disciplines his father enrolled him in, and the specific disciplines he later chose himself, happened to produce, entirely by accident and entirely by design simultaneously, a body that operated exactly like the body special forces trainers spent their entire careers trying to find. It began with karate. Karate, practiced correctly and practiced young, does something to the nervous system that most people who have not experienced it from the inside cannot fully appreciate. It does not simply teach the body to move in certain ways. It teaches the body to be still in certain ways, to occupy space with a quality of readiness that is invisible to the untrained eye, but immediately legible to anyone who has been trained to look for it. Van Damme began this training at 10 years old and did not stop. By the time he was 14, his karate instructor, a man named Claude Guts, who had trained serious competitors for 2 decades, said something to Lucien Van Damme that Lucien would remember for the rest of his life. He said, "Your son does not learn karate. He absorbs it. There is a difference. Most students learn. Your son absorbs. I have seen this once before, in 30 years. Lucien Van Damme nodded. He did not fully understand what the instructor meant. His son, who was standing close enough to hear, understood completely. The karate was the foundation, but a foundation is only as valuable as what gets built on top of it. And what Jean-Claude Van Damme chose to build on top of his karate foundation was something that no one in his community had anticipated, that no one in his community initially respected, and that would turn out to be the single most important physical decision of his life. At the age of 16, Jean-Claude Van Damme made a decision that everyone around him thought was insane. He enrolled in ballet, not as a joke, not as a dare, not as the kind of brief, experimental detour that young athletes sometimes take before returning to the familiar. He enrolled in the Royal Ballet School of Brussels and trained seriously, consistently, and with the same total commitment he brought to every physical discipline he had ever touched. The reaction from his peers in the martial arts community was what you would expect. It was not kind. But Van Damme, who had by this point developed a very specific relationship with other people's opinions of his choices, a relationship characterized primarily by indifference, continued. And what ballet did to his body was something that no special forces trainer who later assessed him could explain without reaching for language that sounds, coming from men whose professional vocabulary tends toward the blunt and functional, almost philosophical. Ballet restructured his proprioception. Proprioception, the body's internal map of itself, its continuous real-time awareness of where every part is in relation to every other part, is the foundation of all elite, physical performance. It is not strength, it is not speed, it is the body's ability to know itself with precision and to act on that knowledge without the delay that conscious thought introduces. Most martial artists develop proprioception within a narrow range, the specific movements and positions their training covers. Outside that range, the map becomes approximate. Ballet, trained seriously over years, expands the range. It forces the body to develop precise awareness of positions and transitions that combat training never visits. Extreme extension, controlled rotation, the management of weight and momentum through angles that fighting stances deliberately avoid. What this produced in Van Damme was a body that could operate with equal precision across a range of positions and velocities that was, by any clinical measure, abnormally large. A former British SAS selection instructor, who worked as a technical advisor on several Van Damme films in the early 1990s, described it this way. Most fighters have a zone. Inside the zone, they are dangerous. Outside it, they are managing. Van Damme did not seem to have an outside. Every position I watched him move through, positions that would put most trained men in recovery mode, he was still operational, still precise. That is not training. That is architecture. Architecture. The word is precise. Because what Van Damme had built, through karate and ballet and Muay Thai, and the specific compounding logic of disciplines that most people would never think to combine, was not a collection of skills. It was a structure. And structures do not behave the way skills behave. Skills can be lost. Skills can be disrupted. Skills depend on conditions being approximately right. Structures persist. Structures operate across conditions. Structures function in the dark, under load, when the conditions have stopped being right and the performance has stopped being possible, and all that remains is the body and whatever it was actually built from. Van Damme's structure was built from something that took most of a childhood and all of an adolescence to assemble. And once assembled, it did not disassemble easily. The third layer was Muay Thai, and the Muay Thai layer is where special forces trainers, the ones who had themselves trained in multiple combat systems and understood from the inside what each one demanded, became most attentive. Because Muay Thai is not, at its foundation, a martial art in the way that most Westerners understand martial arts. It is a damage management system. The Thai fighters who developed it over centuries were not primarily interested in winning quickly. They were interested in being able to fight continuously, under accumulating damage, for longer than the other man. The art is designed to turn the human body into something that can absorb punishment that would end most fights and keep generating offense. The shin conditioning alone, the deliberate, years-long process of calcifying the shin bone through repeated impact until it becomes a striking instrument of a density that most people would classify as inhuman, represents a commitment to physical transformation that filters out everyone who approaches it casually. Van Damme did not approach it casually. He trained under a Thai instructor in Belgium in his late teens, then continued in Los Angeles after his arrival in 1982 at a gym that several former military personnel also used. Was here, in the overlapping world of serious Muay Thai training and the men who trained there, that the first direct observations from people with special forces backgrounds began to accumulate. One of those men, a former US Army Ranger who had transitioned into private security consulting, trained alongside Van Damme for approximately 4 months in 1983. He later described the experience in terms that were characteristically direct. "I have trained with a lot of people, military guys, fighters, athletes. You develop a sense pretty quickly for who is real and who is performing. Van Damme was the most real civilian I ever trained with, and I use the word civilian carefully, because in terms of what his body could do and how it did it, he was not really operating like a civilian. He was operating like someone who had been through a selection process that no one had officially designed for him, but his life had somehow delivered anyway. A selection process that no one had officially designed for him, but his life had somehow delivered anyway." This is the sentence that sits at the center of everything the Special Forces community observed about Van Damme, because what his childhood and adolescence had produced, the layering of karate over ballet over Muay Thai, the decades of early morning training in cold European gyms, the specific psychological profile of a boy who was told repeatedly that his body was wrong and responded by making it extraordinary, was functionally equivalent to a selection and training pipeline. Not the same as Special Forces training, but producing, in the body and nervous system, many of the same outcomes. The same capacity to operate under pressure that others could not sustain. The same automatic precision in conditions that would reduce most people to approximation. The same fundamental relationship between pain and performance, not the suppression of one to maintain the other, but the genuine decoupling of the two, so that the body could continue doing what it was built to do, regardless of what the signals were telling it about the cost. These outcomes are not common. In the general population, they are rare enough that the systems designed to find them, selection courses, assessment pipelines, the elaborate machinery that special operations communities have built to identify who belongs, exist precisely because you cannot find these bodies by looking at them. You find them by watching what they do when conditions get hard enough that performance becomes impossible and all that is left is what the body actually is. In the late 1980s, as Van Damme's career began to generate the kind of momentum that brought serious technical consultants onto film sets, the observations became more formal, not assessments in the clinical, documented sense. There were no forms filled out, no scores recorded, no official evaluation that found its way into any file, but in the informal, continuous way that men with special forces backgrounds assess everyone they encounter, because the habit, once formed, does not switch off. Van Damme was evaluated, and the evaluations were consistent. The first thing they noted was his reaction time under genuine surprise. On a film set, unlike in a controlled training environment, things go wrong without warning. Equipment fails, stuntmen miss marks, unexpected physical contact happens at unexpected angles and unexpected velocities. For most actors, even physically capable ones, genuine surprise produces a visible disruption, a flinch, a freeze, a moment of recalibration before the body can respond. Van Damme did not flinch, not in the suppressed, trained way that some martial artists learn to manage their startle response. In the deeper way, the way that suggests the startle response itself has been so thoroughly overwritten by patterned physical confidence that it no longer fires at the same threshold. A former French GIGN operator who consulted on a Van Damme production in the early 1990s made a specific observation about this. He said, "The startle threshold is one of the first things we look at in selection, not because we can train it directly, you cannot train it directly, but because it tells you something about the depth of a man's physical confidence. A man who has genuinely mastered his body at a deep level does not startle the same way." Van Damme's threshold was where I would expect to find it in a man who had been through serious operational training. In an actor, I had never seen it before. The second thing they noted was his pain processing. Combat training, at the serious end of the spectrum, does not try to make men insensitive to pain. That approach produces brittle fighters, men who have suppressed the signal but not addressed the underlying relationship between pain and performance. What serious training produces instead is a different relationship with the signal itself. Pain is received, processed, and categorized, threat or noise, and then either acted upon or set aside, without the emotional charge that turns discomfort into disruption. Van Damme's relationship with pain was, by every account from people who worked closely with him during physical production, anomalous. Not because he was insensitive to it, but because of what it did not do to his movement. A stunt coordinator who worked with him on multiple productions described watching Van Damme complete a technically demanding fight sequence on a day when he had a torn muscle in his shoulder, a fact that the stunt coordinator only discovered after the sequence was complete. I watched that sequence back in editing later, and I could not find it. There was nothing in the movement that told me, and I was looking because I knew by then, a torn muscle in the shoulder should show up in the way a man moves his arm. It shows up in the rotation, in the reach, in the way he protects that side without realizing he is doing it. There was nothing. His body had simply decided that information was not relevant to what it was doing. That sentence, spoken by a stunt professional who had worked with hundreds of physically capable men across decades of film production, represents something that requires a moment to fully absorb, because it describes not a technique, not a trained response, not a coping mechanism or a feared undue suppression strategy or an act of willpower. It describes a body that had developed, through years of layered training, the ability to functionally partition information, to receive a signal, assess its relevance to the task at hand, and route it away from the channels that would allow it to affect performance. This is not a common ability. In the clinical literature on elite performance, it appears consistently in one population: operators. No examination of what special forces trainers observed in Van Damme's body can avoid the split. The image is so associated with him, so thoroughly embedded in the cultural shorthand for what he represents, that it has become almost impossible to see it clearly. It has become a trick, a party piece, a visual joke that his own later career leaned into with the famous Volvo advertisement and 1,000 imitations. But to the men who understood bodies from the inside, the split was never a trick, it was a diagnostic. Full hip flexibility, of the kind required to execute a true split, not a performed approximation, but a genuine, relaxed, zero-strain full extension, requires a specific combination of structural and developed characteristics that almost never appear together in a body that is also generating significant muscle mass and explosive power. The hip structure itself must permit the range. The surrounding musculature must be both strong enough to control the position and flexible enough not to resist it. The nervous system must be patterned to release rather than contract under the specific load that full extension creates, the opposite of what powerful muscles are trained to do. In clinical terms, Van Damme's hip mobility, in combination with his strength and power output, represented a physical profile that exercise physiologists working in special forces assessment contexts described, when they encountered it, as occurring in approximately 1 in several thousand male athletes. Not 1 in 100, not 1 in 1,000, 1 in several thousand. And the implications of that profile for combat capability were not cosmetic. The same hip architecture that allowed the split allowed Van Damme to generate kick angles and rotational velocities that fighters with normal hip mobility simply could not replicate, and, more importantly, could not easily defend against, because defending against a strike requires being able to model its trajectory, and the trajectory of a kick thrown from a hip that moves like Van Damme's hip moved does not follow the lines that trained defensive instinct anticipates. A former US Navy SEAL who worked briefly as a consultant on a Van Damme production made the observation that has been quoted in various forms by several people who were present for it. In a real situation, not a competition, not a sparring session with rules, a real situation, the thing that kills you is usually the thing you did not model. You can defend what you have seen before. You defend it without thinking. What Van Damme could do with his hips, I had not seen before. Not in training, not in the field, not anywhere. In a real situation, that would be a problem. A serious problem. In a real situation, that would be a problem. Coming from a man whose professional life had consisted largely of real situations. This was not a casual compliment. It was a clinical assessment delivered in the only register that men like that deliver assessments in. Quietly, precisely, without decoration. The body that Special Forces trainers described as engineered did not come free. The same architecture that produced extraordinary capability produced extraordinary demand. A body that operates at the level Van Damme's operated at in his peak years requires maintenance that most people would classify as a full-time occupation. The flexibility must be worked, the conditioning must be sustained, the nervous system patterns must be continuously reinforced, or they begin, slowly, to unwind. Van Damme understood this, and there were years. The years when the cocaine and the marriages and the money and the specific madness of being a certain kind of famous in a certain era all arrived simultaneously, when the maintenance fell apart. The men who had assessed his body and understood what it required watched this period with the specific, helpless recognition of people who know exactly what is being lost and cannot stop it from being lost. A former trainer who had worked with Van Damme during this period described it without sentiment. The body does not forget. That is the good news and the bad news both. The patterns are there. They do not disappear, but they need to be fed, and when you stop feeding them, what you get is a body that remembers what it was capable of and is no longer capable of it. That is a specific kind of suffering. Most people never experience it because most people were never capable of what he was capable of. He was. The body does not forget. And Van Damme, in the years when he put down what he had been carrying and began again, the training returning, the clarity returning, the specific quality of physical presence that had stopped people and made them look again returning, proved the trainer right. The patterns were still there. They had simply been waiting. The men who assessed Jean-Claude Van Damme's body were not given to hyperbole. Their professional culture ran in the opposite direction. Understatement was a value. Precision was a value. The casual inflation of assessment, the tendency to describe the merely good as exceptional and the exceptional as historic, was something their training had specifically and deliberately removed. When these men said that Van Damme's body was engineered for a kind of violence most men could not access, they were not being poetic. They were being precise. What his childhood had built, without a plan, without a design document, without anyone sitting down and deciding that karate plus ballet plus Muay Thai plus the specific psychological pressure of being told your body was wrong and deciding to make it extraordinary would produce this specific outcome, was a nervous system and a physical architecture that occupied a category most human bodies never enter. Not stronger than the strongest men they had trained, not faster than the fastest, but more complete. More capable across a broader range of positions, velocities, angles, and conditions than any single specialist. More able to operate precisely when the conditions stopped being ideal, when the surface was wrong, when the angle was wrong, when the damage was accumulating and the rational mind was filing objections and the body had to decide on its own whether to keep going. Van Damme's body kept going. That was the engineering. That was what the trainers saw. Not a movie star who had learnt some impressive tricks. A body that had been built over decades for something real and had then, almost incidentally, ended up in the movies. Jean-Claude Van Damme never served in any military. He never went through any selection process. No one ever formally evaluated him against the standards that special operations communities use to decide who belongs and who does not. But the men who knew those standards, who had written them, who had administered them, who had watched thousands of candidates succeed and fail against them, looked at what his life had built and arrived, independently and consistently, at the same conclusion. He would have passed. Not easily. Nothing about Jean-Claude Van Damme was ever easy. But he would have passed. And in the specific, demanding, unsentimental world of the men who made that judgment, there is no higher thing that can be said about a body. There is no higher thing at all. Jean-Claude Van Damme began karate training at the age of 10. He holds a black belt in karate, trained seriously in ballet for 5 years, and competed in full-contact Muay Thai before the age of 20. He performed the majority of his own stunts across more than 50 films. No official Special Forces assessment of Jean-Claude Van Damme exists, but the men who would have administered one know what the result would have been. They always know.